At 62, Nathaniel Hayes had reached the age when most men began measuring their lives by what they could leave behind. For 34 years, he had believed his greatest achievement wasn't the company he had built from a tiny construction business into a multi-million-dollar firm. It wasn't the lake house, the investments, or the properties scattered across 3 states. It was his family. His wife, Evelyn, had stood beside him through every difficult year, and their 3 children, Daniel, Marcus, and Sophie, had grown up calling him Dad. Nathaniel had never been the kind of father who measured love in money. He attended school plays, sat through endless soccer games, paid college tuition, helped Daniel buy his first home, and quietly rescued Marcus from business mistakes he was too embarrassed to admit. Sophie, the youngest, had always been his soft spot. Even when she moved across the country after college, Nathaniel called her every Sunday. So, when his financial advisor suggested that he finally establish a family trust, Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He decided to place $6 million into it, $2 million designated for each child. He imagined the money would give them security long after he was gone. He had no idea that, within weeks, that trust would become the reason his entire family would collapse. The day Nathaniel signed the documents, he came home carrying a thick leather folder and an unusually peaceful smile. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of tea, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and asked what had put him in such a good mood. Nathaniel told her about the trust, expecting her to smile. Instead, she stared at him for several seconds before saying, "You really put $6 million aside for them?" Nathaniel laughed softly. "There are children, Evelyn. Who else would I leave it to?" Something changed in her face. It was so brief that Nathaniel almost missed it, a flicker of fear followed by something that looked disturbingly like relief. She quickly smiled and congratulated him, but Nathaniel noticed her fingers trembling around the teacup. He asked if she was all right. "I'm fine," she whispered. "It's just, you've been talking about the future a lot lately." Nathaniel kissed her forehead and told her that after 34 years together, he thought they had earned the right to plan for it. Evelyn smiled again, but this time the smile didn't reach her eyes. That evening, Nathaniel went upstairs and found her standing alone in their bedroom closet, staring at an old photograph. The moment she noticed him, she shoved the photograph into a drawer and locked it. 2 weeks passed. Nathaniel didn't think much about the strange moment in the closet until one Thursday evening, when Evelyn asked him to sit down in the living room. Her voice sounded different, flat, almost rehearsed. Nathaniel turned off the television and looked at her. "What's wrong?" he asked. Evelyn sat opposite him, with both hands folded tightly in her lap. For almost a minute, she said nothing. Then she looked directly into his eyes and said something that made the room seem to lose all its air. "Nathaniel, the children aren't yours." He stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence, because surely there had to be one. Maybe she meant biologically. Maybe there was some medical explanation. Maybe she was talking about something completely different. But Evelyn didn't look away. "Daniel ain't your son. Marcus isn't your son. And Sophie," her voice broke, "Sophie isn't your daughter either." Nathaniel's face went completely still. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He simply stared at the woman he had loved for 34 years, as though he had never seen her before. Finally, he whispered, "What did you just say?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "None of them are yours." Nathaniel stood slowly. His first thought wasn't anger. It was every memory he had ever made with those 3 children. Daniel learning to ride a bicycle while Nathaniel ran behind him. Marcus falling asleep against his shoulder during a thunderstorm. Sophie at 6 years old, running through the airport and screaming "Daddy" when Nathaniel returned from a business trip. 34 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, hospital rooms, graduations, arguments, hugs, and whispered promises suddenly felt like someone had taken a match to his entire life. He asked Evelyn who their biological father was. She said she couldn't tell him. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You just told me I've spent 34 years raising 3 children who aren't mine, and you're telling me you can't tell me who their father is." Evelyn began crying, But Nathaniel noticed something that disturbed him even more. She didn't look surprised by his reaction. She looked prepared for it, as though she had rehearsed this confession many times. Then she said, "There is something else you need to understand. They already know." Nathaniel's heart seemed to stop. "They know what?" he asked. Evelyn looked down at the floor. "They've known for years." Nathaniel couldn't sleep that night. At 17 in the morning, he was sitting alone in his study, staring at the trust documents he had signed only 14 days earlier. $6 million, $2 million for each child he had believed was his. His hands moved slowly across the pages until he reached the section concerning beneficiaries. Then he remembered something his lawyer, Richard Cole, had told him before signing. "Nathaniel, once you fund this trust, changing the beneficiaries becomes complicated but not impossible." Nathaniel reached for his phone. He hesitated for only a second before dialing Richard's private number. The lawyer answered grudgingly, "Nathaniel, it's almost 2:30. Nathaniel stared through the dark window at the empty backyard where his children had once played. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "Richard, I need you to do something for me first thing tomorrow morning." "What is it?" Richard asked. Nathaniel looked at the $6 million trust sitting on his desk. "Freeze every distribution. Don't tell Evelyn. Don't tell my children. And most importantly," he paused, feeling something inside him harden for the first time in his life, "I want you to find out exactly where that $6 million would have gone if I had died tomorrow." The next morning, Nathaniel arrived at Richard Cole's office before sunrise. He had barely slept, and yet there was something strangely calm about him now. Richard had been his attorney for nearly 20 years, so he immediately recognized that Nathaniel wasn't there for an ordinary legal matter. Nathaniel placed the trust documents on his desk and said, "I want everything frozen." Richard adjusted his glasses. "That's what you said last night, but I need to know why." Nathaniel looked him straight in the eyes. "Evelyn told me none of my 3 children are biologically mine." Richard went completely silent. For several seconds, he simply stared at Nathaniel. Then he slowly asked, "Did she tell you who their biological father is?" Nathaniel shook his head. "No, but she told me something worse. She said all 3 children already knew." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Nathaniel, are you absolutely certain she said all 3? Nathaniel's voice dropped. "I heard every word." Richard immediately began reviewing the trust documents. Nathaniel watched him carefully, but after several minutes, the lawyer's expression changed. "There's something unusual here," Richard said. Nathaniel leaned forward. "What?" Richard turned the document around. "When we established the trust, Evelyn wasn't listed as a beneficiary. Neither were any outside relatives. Everything was divided equally among Daniel, Marcus, and Sophie." Nathaniel nodded. "Exactly." Richard tapped another page. "But there is a secondary clause. If any beneficiary is proven not to be your biological child, the trustee has discretion to suspend their distribution until the matter is resolved." Nathaniel stared at him. "Can you legally verify their parentage?" Richard nodded slowly. "With the proper consent or court process?" "Yes, but I need to ask you something first." "Do you want the truth?" Nathaniel almost laughed. "Richard, my wife just told me that 3 decades of my life were built on a lie. At this point, I don't think the truth can hurt me any more than the lie already has." Richard lowered his voice. "Then don't confront them yet. Let me investigate quietly." That evening, Nathaniel returned home and acted as though nothing had happened. Evelyn was preparing dinner when he walked into the kitchen. She looked at him nervously. "How was your morning?" she asked. Nathaniel hung his coat and smiled faintly. "Busy." He didn't mention Richard. He didn't mention the trust. He didn't ask about the children's biological father. Instead, he sat at the table and watched Evelyn move around the kitchen. For 34 years, he had known her habits: the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous, the way she tapped her fingers against the counter when she was hiding something. That night, she did both. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and immediately turned it face down. Nathaniel casually asked, "Who was that?" Evelyn froze. Nobody. Nathaniel smiled. Nobody has a name now. She forced a laugh. It was Sophie. Nathaniel said nothing, but something inside him shifted. Sophie had always been the easiest child for Evelyn to discuss. Why would a simple text from her make Evelyn look frightened? Later that night, Nathaniel walked downstairs for water and heard voices coming from the study. He stopped when he recognized Daniel's voice. "Mom, you promised Dad wouldn't find out like this." Nathaniel froze behind the partially closed door. Evelyn whispered something he couldn't hear. Then Marcus spoke. "This is getting out of control." "We knew this would happen eventually." Nathaniel's heart pounded. He reached for the doorknob but stopped himself. He needed to hear more. Daniel said, "What about the trust?" Evelyn answered, "That's exactly why I told him now." There was a long silence. Then Marcus asked, "Does he still think we're getting the money?" Evelyn's voice became cold. "If he does, let him keep thinking that for now." Nathaniel felt the blood drain from his face. He had expected betrayal from his wife. He had never imagined his children were sitting in the same room discussing his $6 million. Then Sophie spoke, and her words were the ones that nearly broke him. "Dad spent his whole life believing we loved him. We can't let him find out that we've known the truth since we were teenagers." Nathaniel quietly stepped away from the door before anyone could discover him. He returned to his bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. His eyes burned, but he refused to cry, not yet. For the first time, he realized Evelyn's confession wasn't the beginning of the betrayal, it was the end of a secret that had involved his entire family for years. He picked up his phone and called Richard. "You were right," Nathaniel whispered. "They all knew." Richard was silent on the other end. Nathaniel continued, "I want DNA testing. All 3 children. And I want you to investigate every financial transaction involving Evelyn, Daniel, Marcus, and Sophie from the last 10 years. Richard asked, "Nathaniel, what are you looking for?" Nathaniel stared at the family photograph sitting on his nightstand. "I don't know yet." He paused. "But if they plan this around my money, I want to know exactly when the plan started." Then Nathaniel noticed something on the photograph he'd never noticed before. It was an old picture from Sophie's 18th birthday. Standing in the background was a man Nathaniel hadn't seen in decades, a man Evelyn had always claimed was merely an old family friend. Nathaniel zoomed in on the photograph. His face went pale. Because that same man had been standing beside Evelyn at the hospital on the day Daniel was born. Nathaniel barely slept after discovering the photograph. Before breakfast, he placed it inside a folder and drove straight to Richard's office. He didn't tell Evelyn where he was going. When Richard saw the photograph, his expression immediately became serious. Nathaniel pointed to the man standing behind Evelyn at the hospital. "His name is Charles Whitmore," Nathaniel said. "At least." Evelyn said he moved overseas shortly after Daniel was born. Richard opened his laptop and began searching through old records. Within 20 minutes, he had found something Nathaniel hadn't expected. Charles hadn't moved overseas. He had remained in the same state for decades, and had owned a private investment company that had quietly done business with one of Nathaniel's own companies. Nathaniel stared at the screen. "You're telling me this man has been living less than 2 hours away from me all these years?" Richard nodded. "And that's not the strangest part." Richard pulled up a series of financial records. Between 12 and 15 years ago, several payments had been made from an account connected to Evelyn to a company owned by Charles. The amounts weren't enormous individually, $5,000 here, $12,000 there, then $25,000, but together they totaled nearly $180,000. Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten. What was the money for? Richard shook his head. "That's what I can't determine yet. The company description is vague." Nathaniel leaned back and closed his eyes. For years, he had believed Evelyn had been financially dependent on him. He had given her access to every account because he trusted her completely. If she had secretly been sending money to Charles, where had it come from? Richard then opened another file. "Nathaniel, there's more." He showed him a property deed. A small lakefront house had been purchased 14 years earlier under a company name. The registered director was Charles Whitmore, but the original deposit had come from an account belonging to Evelyn. Nathaniel stared at the document. 14 years earlier was when Marcus had started college. Nathaniel had worked almost 70 hours a week that year to cover tuition and expenses. He had never known Evelyn had money moving elsewhere. That afternoon, Nathaniel decided to test his family without revealing what he knew. He called Daniel first and invited him to dinner. Daniel arrived at the house wearing an expensive suit and carrying a bottle of wine. He hugged Nathaniel tightly, just as he always had. "Dad, it's good to see you." Nathaniel smiled. "Good to see you too, son." The word son nearly caught in his throat. During dinner, Nathaniel casually mentioned that he was reviewing his estate plan because he wanted to simplify his affairs. Daniel immediately put down his fork. "You're not thinking about changing the trust, are you?" Nathaniel looked up. "Why would you ask that?" Daniel hesitated. "I just mean, you worked hard for that money. You should make sure everything is organized." Nathaniel nodded. "Of course." Then he asked, "If you didn't receive a penny from me after I died, would you still consider me your father?" Daniel's face changed for half a second. "What kind of question is that?" Nathaniel smiled sadly. "Just an old man's question." Daniel reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Dad, money doesn't change family." Nathaniel looked into his eyes and wondered why Daniel's voice sounded like someone repeating a line he had practiced. The following morning, Marcus arrived unexpectedly. He claimed he was simply checking on Nathaniel, but within 10 minutes he was asking about the trust. "Dad, you know Mom has been worried about your health," Marcus said. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "My health? You know what I mean? You're getting older. Everyone wants to make sure the estate is protected." Nathaniel quietly watched him. Then he said, "Richard told me the trust can be changed if circumstances change." Marcus's expression immediately tightened. "Changed how?" Nathaniel shrugged. "I haven't decided." Marcus suddenly became angry. "After everything we've done for you." Nathaniel almost laughed. "Everything you've done for me." Marcus realized his mistake and quickly softened his voice. "I mean everything you've done for us." Nathaniel nodded. "That's what I thought you meant." Marcus left less than an hour later. The moment his car disappeared down the driveway, Nathaniel received a text message from Richard. "We have results from the preliminary investigation. You need to see this before you speak to Sophie." Nathaniel opened the attached file and his hands began to shake. The document contained something that changed the entire direction of Nathaniel's investigation. Richard had discovered that Charles Whitmore wasn't simply an old friend of Evelyn's. Charles had been Evelyn's business partner before Nathaniel ever met her. More disturbing was the timeline. Charles and Evelyn had separated financially just 3 months before Nathaniel and Evelyn got married, but their financial connection had never truly ended. Richard had also found evidence that Evelyn had contacted Charles only 6 days before. Nathaniel signed the $6 million trust. Nathaniel stared at that date again and again. 6 days. It couldn't be coincidence. Then Richard called. "There's one more thing," he said. Nathaniel answered immediately. "What?" Richard's voice became unusually cautious. "I found an old hospital record connected to Daniel's birth. Charles Whitmore's name appears as an emergency contact." Nathaniel's heart slammed against his ribs. "That doesn't prove he's Daniel's father." Richard paused. "No, but I also found the name of the attending physician." Nathaniel frowned. "Who?" Richard replied, "Dr. Samuel Whitmore, Charles's younger brother." Nathaniel slowly lowered the phone. For 34 years, he had believed Daniel's birth was the happiest day of his life. Now he was beginning to wonder whether the entire event had been carefully arranged around him. Nathaniel drove home, with Richard's words repeating in his mind. He had spent 34 years believing Daniel's birth was the beginning of his family, but now even that memory felt uncertain. When he entered the house, Evelyn was sitting in the living room waiting for him. She immediately noticed his expression. "What's happened?" she asked. Nathaniel removed his coat and calmly replied, "I met with Richard." Evelyn's face went pale. "Why?" Nathaniel sat across from her. "Because I need answers." She looked away. Nathaniel, I already told you the truth. He shook his head. No, Evelyn, you told me enough to hurt me. You didn't tell me enough to understand what happened. Evelyn began crying. Nathaniel placed the photograph of Charles on the table. Who is he? Her eyes landed on it, and every bit of color disappeared from her face. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Finally, she whispered, You weren't supposed to find that. That sentence told Nathaniel more than any confession could have. He leaned forward. So, you admit you've been hiding something. Evelyn wiped her tears. Charles was part of my life before you. Nathaniel stared at her. Before me, she nodded. I was young. I made mistakes. Nathaniel's voice hardened. 3 children aren't a mistake. Evelyn, she looked at him with tears running down her cheeks. You don't understand. Nathaniel stood. Then explain it. Evelyn finally admitted that Charles had been involved with her before their marriage, but she insisted that Nathaniel was the only father the children had ever known. You raised them. You loved them. You were there for everything. Nathaniel's eyes filled with disbelief. That's not what I asked. Are they his? Evelyn didn't answer. Nathaniel repeated the question. Still nothing. Then she whispered, Daniel is. Nathaniel closed his eyes. One child, one confirmation, but he already knew there was more. And Marcus? Evelyn began sobbing. I don't know. Nathaniel looked at her sharply. You don't know. Then she said something that made his entire body go cold. And Sophie was conceived after Charles disappeared. Nathaniel stared at her. Then who is Sophie's father? Evelyn shook her head. I don't know. He almost laughed from the sheer absurdity of it. You don't know who the father of your own daughter is. Evelyn covered her face. Nathaniel walked toward the window, trying to control his breathing. For 34 years, he had never once questioned whether Sophie was his. He remembered holding her for the first time, how tiny she had been, how she wrapped her fingers around his thumb. He remembered staying awake beside her hospital bed when she had pneumonia at 9. He remembered telling her that no matter where life took her, she would always have a home with him. And now Evelyn was telling him she didn't even know whether he was her biological father. Nathaniel turned around. Why did you let me believe all 3 were mine? Evelyn's answer came quietly, because you loved them. That's not an answer. She looked up, because if I had told you the truth back then, I knew you'd leave. And I couldn't lose the life we'd built. Nathaniel's face hardened. So, you didn't choose me. You chose my usefulness. Before Evelyn could answer, Nathaniel's phone rang. It was Richard. Nathaniel stepped into the hallway and answered. Tell me you have something. Richard didn't waste time. We found the original trust planning notes. Nathaniel frowned. What notes? Richard explained that when the $6 million trust had first been discussed, someone had contacted the law firm anonymously asking very specific questions about what would happen to the money if Nathaniel died without a biological heir. Nathaniel's stomach dropped. Who contacted you? Richard hesitated. We don't have a name, but the call came from a number registered to a private company. Nathaniel asked for the company name. Richard gave it to him. Nathaniel immediately recognized it. It belonged to Charles Whitmore. Nathaniel's hand tightened around the phone. When did he call? Richard answered. 3 months ago. Nathaniel froze. That was before he had even told his family about the trust. Before he had discussed his estate plans with anyone. Someone had known about his money before he had officially decided what to do with it. Richard continued, and Nathaniel, there's another problem. Charles isn't the only person who contacted my office. Nathaniel's voice dropped. Who else? Richard said, Your son Marcus. Nathaniel returned to the living room and found Evelyn standing near the window. He didn't tell her about Marcus. Instead, he calmly said, I need you to call all 3 children. Evelyn stared at him. Why? Because we're going to have a family dinner tomorrow night. Her eyes widened. Nathaniel, please don't do this. He looked at her. Why? Are you afraid of what they'll say? Evelyn shook her head. You don't know what you're getting into. Nathaniel stepped closer. That's exactly why I'm doing it. That night, he called Richard again and instructed him to prepare 3 separate DNA tests. He also asked him to investigate Charles's company, Evelyn's hidden accounts, and every financial connection between the family members. Then Nathaniel did something nobody expected. He left the $6 million trust exactly where it was. Richard asked why. Nathaniel replied, "Because I want them to believe the money is still waiting for them." He knew the truth would come soon, but he wanted to see who would reveal themselves when they thought millions of dollars were still within reach. And the next morning, as Nathaniel sat alone at his desk, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Evelyn, Charles, and a newborn baby, but the baby wasn't Daniel. On the back, someone had written 6 words, "You were never supposed to know." Nathaniel stared at the photograph for so long that the words written on the back began to blur. The baby in Evelyn's arms was unmistakably a newborn, and Charles stood beside her with one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. But Nathaniel recognized the hospital blanket immediately. It was from the same hospital where Marcus had been born. He turned the photograph over again, searching for a date, a name, anything that could explain what he was seeing. There was nothing except the 6 words, "You were never supposed to know." Nathaniel immediately called Richard and sent him a picture of the photograph. Richard called back minutes later. "Nathaniel, don't confront anyone yet." Nathaniel's voice was cold. "Why?" Richard replied. "Because I've found something that makes this much bigger than paternity." He explained that Charles's company had made several payments to a private investigator. Over the previous year, the investigator had been tracking Nathaniel's assets, properties, and estate plans. "Someone has been studying your finances," Richard said. Nathaniel looked at the photograph again. "For how long?" Richard paused. "At least 4 years. That afternoon, Nathaniel received a call from Sophie. She sounded nervous. "Dad, can I come over?" Nathaniel immediately said yes. When she arrived, she looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept. She walked into his study and closed the door behind her. "Dad, I need to tell you something before Mom does." Nathaniel's heart tightened, but he kept his expression calm. "I'm listening." Sophie sat down and began crying. "I knew about Daniel. I knew he wasn't biologically yours." Nathaniel said nothing. "Mom told me when I was 17. She said it was an accident and that you could never know." Nathaniel's voice was quiet. "And Marcus?" Sophie looked down. "I was told he was yours." Nathaniel stared at her. "You were told?" Sophie immediately realized what she'd said. Nathaniel leaned forward. "Sophie, what exactly did your mother tell you?" She hesitated before answering. "She said Marcus's father was someone she met after you two separated for a short time." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "We never separated." Sophie looked shocked. "That's not what Mom told me." For the first time, Nathaniel realized that Evelyn might have created different versions of the truth for each member of the family. He asked Sophie about the trust. She began crying harder. "Mom told us that if something happened to you, the 3 of us would inherit everything. She said we needed to stay close to you because you were getting older." Nathaniel's expression changed. "Who told her that?" Sophie whispered. "Charles." When Sophie left, Nathaniel sat alone for nearly an hour. Then Richard called with the DNA results. Nathaniel had expected uncertainty, but the results were devastatingly clear. Daniel was not his biological son. Marcus was not his biological son, but Sophie was. Nathaniel closed his eyes. Of all the revelations, that one hurt the most. Sophie had always been the child he considered most like himself. The same stubbornness, the same sense of humor, the same habit of tapping her fingers when she was thinking. He had never needed DNA to call her his daughter, yet now he knew that, biologically, she really was. Richard then explained something else. "There's an issue with Marcus's result?" Nathaniel frowned. "What kind of issue?" Richard said, "The DNA profile suggests his biological father may be someone related to you." Nathaniel went completely still. "Related to me how?" Richard answered carefully, "We don't know yet. But the genetic markers indicate a close paternal connection." Nathaniel immediately thought of his younger brother, Thomas, who had died 12 years earlier. Thomas had always been close to Evelyn. Too close, Nathaniel suddenly realized. Memories he dismissed as harmless began returning: private conversations, unexplained visits, the way Thomas had always insisted on taking care of Evelyn whenever Nathaniel traveled. Nathaniel asked Richard to investigate Thomas's old records. Within hours, Richard discovered something astonishing. 12 years before Thomas's death, he had quietly opened a bank account under a variation of his middle name. The account had received regular deposits from Charles's company. But that wasn't the worst discovery. Richard found a medical record showing that Thomas had undergone a fertility procedure years before Nathaniel married Evelyn. The procedure had resulted in stored genetic material being placed in a private fertility clinic. Nathaniel stared at the report. Are you telling me Marcus could have been conceived using my brother's genetic material? Richard answered, We don't know yet, but we're investigating. Nathaniel felt physically sick. If that were true, Marcus wasn't simply another man's son. He could be Nathaniel's nephew, and suddenly an old memory returned. The year before Marcus was born, Evelyn had told Nathaniel she had suffered a miscarriage while he was away on a 6-week business trip. Nathaniel had believed her, but if the medical records were real, something else had happened during those 6 weeks, something involving Thomas, Evelyn, and Charles. That evening, Nathaniel called all 3 children and Evelyn to dinner. He told them nothing about the DNA results. Everyone arrived expecting an ordinary family meal, but the moment they sat down, Nathaniel noticed the tension. Daniel kept checking his phone. Marcus avoided eye contact. Evelyn looked terrified. Sophie was the only one who seemed genuinely heartbroken. Nathaniel poured himself a glass of water and placed the mysterious photograph in the center of the table. Evelyn immediately recognized it. Her hand flew to her mouth. Daniel stood up. Where did you get that? Nathaniel looked at him. That's a very interesting question. Marcus suddenly pushed his chair backward. I'm leaving. Nathaniel's voice became firm. Sit down. Marcus froze. Nathaniel looked at each of them one by one. For 34 years, I believed I was your father. I worked for you. I protected you. I loved you. And apparently, all 3 of you knew there was a secret I didn't. Daniel whispered. Dad. Nathaniel raised his hand. Don't call me that because you think it will save you. The room fell silent. Then Nathaniel placed 3 sealed envelopes on the table. These are DNA results. Evelyn began sobbing. Nathaniel looked directly at her and said, And before anyone opens theirs, I want to know why Charles Whitmore has been investigating my $6 million for the last 4 years. Nobody moved. Nathaniel's question hung over the dining room like a storm. Evelyn was crying silently. Daniel looked terrified, and Marcus had gone completely pale. Sophie stared at the 3 envelopes on the table. Nathaniel slowly pushed them forward. Open them. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened his first. His eyes moved across the page, and his face collapsed. Marcus opened his next. Sophie was the last. She read her result and immediately began crying. Nathaniel didn't need to look at the papers. Richard had already told him the truth. Daniel was not his biological son. Marcus was not his biological son. Sophie was. Nathaniel looked at his wife. 34 years, Evelyn. 34 years you let me believe 2 children were mine when they weren't, and you made all 3 of them believe they had to protect your secret. Evelyn finally whispered, I was afraid. Nathaniel answered, No, you are calculating. Then Daniel finally confessed everything. Charles had discovered years earlier that Nathaniel had no biological heirs except Sophie. But he also knew Nathaniel had never cared about bloodlines. Nathaniel had always planned to divide his fortune equally among all 3 children. Charles realized that the easiest way to gain access to the family's wealth wasn't to convince Nathaniel, it was to control Evelyn. For years, Charles had pressured her to keep the children's parentage hidden. When Nathaniel began discussing retirement and estate planning, Charles became desperate. He wanted Evelyn to convince Nathaniel to create a trust large enough to secure the family's future. Daniel admitted that he and Marcus had known pieces of the truth for years, but they never understood how far Charles's plan had gone. Mom told us you would eventually leave everything to us, Daniel said. She made us believe that if we stayed close to you, nothing would change. Nathaniel stared at him. So all those calls, all those dinners, all those times you told me you loved me. Daniel began crying. Some of it was real, Dad. Nathaniel's expression softened. For one painful second, some of it isn't enough. Marcus then revealed the final secret. He wasn't Charles's son. The DNA evidence had been confusing because Marcus's biological father was Nathaniel's late brother, Thomas. Evelyn had secretly used Thomas's stored genetic material after Nathaniel's supposed separation from her, something Nathaniel had never known had happened. Charles had helped arrange the procedure and had later used the secret to control Evelyn. But there was one detail Charles hadn't expected. Marcus had discovered the truth only months earlier. He had confronted Charles, and Charles threatened to expose Evelyn unless Marcus cooperated. That explained Marcus's strange behavior and his obsession with the trust. Nathaniel finally understood why everyone had been acting so strangely. The family hadn't simply been hiding a paternity secret. They had been trapped inside a web of lies that Charles had spent decades maintaining. Nathaniel looked at Sophie, who was still crying. "Did you know I was your biological father?" he asked. Sophie shook her head. "No, Mom told me she didn't know." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "At least now I know one thing wasn't a lie." Sophie looked at him through her tears. "Dad, I never cared about your money." Nathaniel replied quietly, "I know." The next morning, Richard arrived at Nathaniel's house with the final documents. Charles's financial scheme had already begun collapsing. The evidence showed that Charles had been attempting to position himself as a financial advisor to Evelyn and had planned to gain control of portions of the family fortune through a series of shell companies. The $6 million trust had been his ultimate target. Nathaniel immediately revoked the planned distributions and placed the money into a new structure controlled by an independent trustee. He didn't give Charles a single dollar. He also separated his personal estate from Evelyn's and began legal proceedings concerning the fraudulent financial activity. But Nathaniel made one decision that surprised everyone. He did not disinherit Daniel or Marcus simply because they weren't biologically his. Instead, he told Richard that the new trust would provide limited support based on actual need, not entitlement. "I raised them," Nathaniel said. "Their DNA doesn't erase 34 years. But neither does love mean they automatically receive everything I built." Daniel eventually apologized without asking for money. Marcus did too. Evelyn, however, never received the forgiveness she wanted. Nathaniel couldn't erase what she had done simply because they had once loved each other. 6 months later, Nathaniel stood on the back porch of his lake house watching Sophie walk toward him. She had moved closer after everything happened, and for the first time in years, their relationship felt completely honest. She handed him a small framed photograph. It showed Nathaniel holding her as a newborn. On the back, Sophie had written, "My father long before I knew what DNA meant." Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears. He hugged her tightly. The $6 million had never really been the greatest inheritance he could leave behind. The real inheritance was the truth and the freedom that came after finally uncovering it. Nathaniel eventually rebuilt his life, but he never returned to the man he had been before that terrible confession. He became wiser, quieter, and far more careful about whom he trusted. Daniel and Marcus remained in his life, though their relationships had to be rebuilt honestly from the ground up. Evelyn left the family home, and Charles disappeared from their lives under the weight of the evidence against him. Nathaniel had once believed family was defined by blood. Then he learned that blood could lie, money could corrupt, and secrets could destroy decades in a single night. But he also learned something more important. Being betrayed doesn't mean the love you gave was wasted. Sometimes the greatest victory ain't getting revenge on the people who hurt you, it is walking away from their lies without allowing those lies to change the person you became.